A bullet from the back of a bush took Medgar Evers' blood. A finger fired the trigger to his name. A handle hid out in the dark. A hand set the spark. Two eyes took the aim behind a man's brain. But he can't be blamed. He's only a pawn in their game. A South politician preaches to the poor white man. You got more than the blacks. Don't complain. You're better than them. You've been born with white skin, they explain. And the black man's name is used as plain for the politician's game as he rises to fame. And the poor white remains on the caboose of the train, but it ain't him to blame. He's only a pawn in their game. Bob Dylan wrote that song in 1963, in a very tumultuous time in this nation's history, during the Civil Rights Movement. Don't take it literally. I mean, obviously the man who shot Medgar Evers is to blame in part. He was part of a bigger problem, but he was a Klansman. He was a racist. He was a bad guy. So the song's not entirely literal, but it's making a point. Dylan goes on to say, talking about poor white people in the South, he's taught in his school from the start by the rule that the laws are with him to protect his white skin, to keep up his hate so he never thinks straight. Not only is it catchy, but it's also true about the United States in the mid-20th century. So, the Civil Rights Movement was about people freeing themselves from oppression. And they used the Constitution to do it. Now, the Constitution is a document. People have to do something with it if they're going to use it. And that's what people did during the Civil Rights Movement. That time period, 20th century United States, really going back to the late 19th century, the late 1800s into the 1900s, the 20th century, it's about people with power trying to keep their power and attempting to do so using the oldest trick in the politician's playbook, uniting your constituency against the common enemy. The common enemy, in the case of powerful politicians in the United States, particularly in the South, during the Civil Rights era, the common enemy was equality. Remember last week in one of these videos I talked about the pie, or the pie that isn't, that rights are not a pie. When you gain some, I don't lose some. There's not a finite quantity. There's not a zero sum at the end. In fact, we can expand rights for everyone, and I don't lose any. Just because someone else gets some. But it's really easy to convince people that it is like a pie. That if that person over there who doesn't have the same rights as me gets some rights under the law, then I somehow lose some. That's not rational, it's not logical, it defies common sense, but it is what people do, people in power do sometimes throughout history to try and keep their power. The constituency I'm talking about during that time was the average white voter. This goes back to way before the Civil War, where there was a mentality perpetuated by powerful white people down south that tried to remind poor white people that their lives could be worse. Which is, again, it's an illogical way to rationalize oppression, and it's an illogical way to rationalize inequality. And this is just inequality among white people, because before the Civil War, during the Civil War, after the Civil War, on into the 20th century, life really sucked for poor white people down south. But it didn't suck near as much as it did for everyone else. People of African descent down south were not doing well as a whole because of institutional racism, because of a system of laws that came to be known as Jim Crow. I talked about the black codes in the last lecture. This is part and parcel of that. as bad as it was for poor whites, as the quality of life down south, it was even worse for black people. And it would have been worse anyway because of social oppression, individual racism, but the institutionalization of racist laws during the Jim Crow era, laws for segregation of public systems and public services, but also private business. The laws down south allowed for the discrimination, segregation of private businesses. And that was legal because of Plessy versus Ferguson, which we talked about in the last lecture. During all this, something that I wish I had time to get into in this class, and I apologize that I haven't, but during the kind of the backdrop of all these things going on to oppress people of color under the law, women actually got the right to vote. Remember, with the 15th Amendment, black men got the right to vote, but women of any color still could not vote. So early 20th century, women get the right to vote. Happens in the 19-teens and 20s. Women's suffrage movement finally comes to a head and is able to secure the vote for women. Then the Great Depression, stock market crashes, and it's not just a recession, which is bad enough. What we had in 2008, 2009 in this country, what it looks like, according to most economic experts we're going to have here in the near future, that's when the economy slows down and it's not humming along as fast as it normally should. A depression is worse. It's like that, like a recession that's even worse. The implications are even harsher on the people of this country or of the world, and it lasts longer. Great Depression lasts a decade, give or take. I'll never forget a story, an essay I read when I was in high school, although I cannot remember the name of it and I can't for the life of me remember the author. I'll never forget a story about a poor black kid, a school-age girl growing up in the South during the Great Depression, and talking about how she heard people in town, this is on a farm in the rural South, heard people in town talk about better times around the corner. You know, Mr. Roosevelt's going to fix our problems. Better times are coming. Happy days will be here again. And she said those are white folks' words, because things were bad for this girl and her family before the Depression. Before the economic depression, it already wasn't great to be a black child in the rural South or any part of the South. So, the Depression lasts until the late 1930s, and you have this continued oppression of people of color throughout. World War II. The United States gets drug into a European and Asian war. We end up being one of the the United States ends up being one of the central figures in that war. Throughout that war, there are black people fighting. And I mentioned Medgar Evers in the Bob Dylan lyrics to start this lecture. Well, Medgar Evers actually fought in the Battle of Normandy, fought for the United States, fought the Nazis. He was one of many, many, many black people. I mentioned black troops in the Civil War. Never forget that. No matter what else you know about American history, never forget that there were black troops fighting in all of our wars in different capacities. And black people fight in World War II. The United States is involved in that war during the 1940s. President is Franklin Roosevelt. He has overseen the transition out of the Great Depression for our economy, but black people still aren't doing too well, socially, legally, in this country. And so he's a tough figure to nail down. He's someone that we'll never really know what was inside of his head. He was a true politician. But he flirted with the possibility of passing anti-lynching legislation, but he could never get momentum for that through the Southern Democrats, his own party, but the Southern version of Democrats, who were in control of the House and the Senate during most of his presidency. He did pass laws that allowed for black people to obtain federal jobs, federal contract work, and other types of federal employment during the Depression and during World War II. Then he's assassinated. Harry Truman becomes president, and Truman issues an executive order to integrate the military and to officially end racial segregation in the military. Now, it doesn't just happen overnight. It's a difficult process, but he did get the ball rolling on that. And Truman, unlike Roosevelt, is from a former slave state. Harry Truman's parents were actually alive during the Civil War. And he grew up in Missouri, a former slave state. And he takes some steps in the right direction, but like Roosevelt, I wouldn't say that Truman was some sort of warrior for equality. We'll talk about some of those later on in this lecture. But still, good thing he did with the military. So, the war ends. We're getting closer to the 1950s. There's still massive oppression in the Jim Crow South. Massive, massive institutional racism. I mentioned people in power uniting their constituency against the common cause. The constituency are white people who are not in power, who are not wealthy and not powerful, and that common cause is equality, racial equality. That idea, perpetuating that idea that more rights for that person over there, fewer rights for me. And this is, not to mix words, abject racism. The driving factor here, well, the driving factor is politicians trying to keep power. The way they do it, the motivation they use, is that racism that's been inherent to the nation's history up through the 1940s, 1950s. The idea that one ethnicity of people is inherently inferior to another, and therefore should not have the same rights under the law, should not hold the same status in society as that so-called inferior race. I'm sorry, so-called superior race. That people should not have the same status. How do you fight that? How do black people and their white allies fight that racism that is at an institutional governmental level? Violence, take up arms and fight the government. That did not work so well for other groups that tried it. Most notably, the American Indians. The American Indians. Don't have time in this lecture or in this class to really get into the history of what happened to the native inhabitants of North America. But it wasn't good. It wasn't good. And it was the opposite of good, in fact. And it ended horribly. You could argue that it has not ended, really. So, just one example of why violence doesn't work when the government has more people, more guns, more cannons at this point, and more weapons at their disposal, both literally and figuratively, to maintain an oppressive situation. So that's one thing. Okay. How about nonviolence? What does that mean? It means putting pressure on policymakers to change policy without a literal gun to their head. You've either got to find policymakers, politicians, brave enough to do the right thing at the risk of their own careers, or change the minds of their constituents so they don't have to be brave, they can do the popular thing and do the right thing. So a nonviolent movement in the United States did a little bit of both, actually did a lot of both, and achieved a significant percentage of its aims, and that is the civil rights movement. Being nonviolent doesn't mean you have to be civil or polite. It also does not mean that your oppressors will not use violence against you. And if you know anything about the civil rights movement, you know that that was certainly the case. The 16th Street church bombing. What did those 4 little girls do to the racists who perpetrated that heinous crime? What about somebody who was doing something, but something nonviolent, like the violence against protesters on Bloody Sunday? What about Emmett Till? We've mentioned Emmett Till in this class, but his brutal murder for no good reason, no reason at all other than abject racism, was one of the catalysts of the civil rights movement. Just because you're nonviolent does not mean your oppressors won't use violence against you. So, 1960s. A lot of things happened. Late 50s into the 60s, a lot of things happened. A few notable things. Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks taking the bus home. She's very tired. She takes a seat. The rules were that if a black person was in the white part of the bus, they had to get up and give up their seat if a white person wanted it. White man gets on, he wants her seat. She says no. She gets arrested. She becomes a hero, but it wasn't easy for her. An organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association, led by a man named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He and his organization lead a boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. They lead a bus boycott that lasts, I believe, over a year. Lasts a long time, gets attention. It gets attention. They're testing this idea that separate parts of the bus are in fact equal. Remember Plessy versus Ferguson? Is something separate? Okay, well, government says that's cool as long as it's equal. And they're like, nah, this is not the same. Sitting in the back of the bus is not the same. It's not. First of all, I should be able to sit wherever I want to sit. And number two, you're doing it along racial lines, which clearly violates the 14th and maybe the 5th Amendment, but certainly the 14th Amendment. So there are different types of protests related to public transportation. Transportation's a big deal. And just for a minute, don't forget, a bus boycott is not easy. It's not a matter of, oh, I guess I'll walk today. Well, how far do you live from work? It's not a matter of, oh, I'll go buy a car. What if you can't afford a car? A lot of these folks who took part in the boycott in Montgomery were residents who could not afford a car, had a long way to get to work. So this wasn't easy. This was as much a part, actually it was much more a part of their everyday life. As far as how it impacted their life is what we're going through with coronavirus is right now, meaning life was not the same when you're taking part in a bus boycott, particularly if it was for the reason that the bus system was racist. So what we're dealing with now and changes to our everyday lives is a fraction of just a bus boycott. And that's the people who didn't even experience violence. And speaking of violence, some folks start taking buses, Greyhound buses, into the southern states. Became known as Freedom Riders. These are black and white people making a point about integrated services. The Supreme Court had said in the early 60s that it was unconstitutional to segregate public bus stations and anything that had to do with public transportation. So they're going to put that to the test. And the first bus that goes through gets a police escort part of the way, but when they get to Montgomery, the police escort fades away, and the people on the bus are brutally attacked. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the brother of the president at that time, John Kennedy, he sends federal marshals down south to try to do something about the violence, but this keeps happening. Freedom Riders, though, it grows. They end up with a whole lot of volunteers willing to do something dangerous to make a point that, hey, the Supreme Court said you can't be segregating anything related to buses, and we're going to make sure you don't. It really was one of those times when people said, you can't kill all of us. They put that to the test. Turns out they were right. There was a case of terrible, atrocious violence in Jackson, Mississippi as well. There were a bunch of these, but Montgomery and Jackson are certainly worth mentioning. And I'm skipping over a lot of really significant events. Oh, the World War sit-in Greensboro. Lots of major events that I encourage you to look up on your own. Or email me if you have questions about them. If you want some resources on them, I can point you in that direction. But look them up. Look up these major events, the civil rights movement. I'm going to skip ahead to the March on Washington, organized by Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, and other people, several other people, leaders of that movement. There were musicians, there were speeches of all types. Actually, Bob Dylan sang the song that I started out by reading excerpts from. And Dr. King is giving a speech. He's giving a speech, and it's a good speech. From what I understand, most of his were pretty darn good. But Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer who was active in the civil rights movement herself, you can hear her shouting halfway through the speech, "Tell him about the dream." And he deviates from his prepared remarks and starts talking about a vision. A vision of a different America. Words matter. Words matter so much. I personally like to say that it's impossible to offend me with words. You can only be offended by someone's actions. That's only somewhat true because some words lead to actions. Some words inspire action. The words that some people say matter more than others. When a future president says that Mexico is sending the United States its rapists and its murderers, people hear that and it carries more weight because of who said it than if I said it or if some random person said it. When a future president says it, it matters. When another future president says there is no black America and there is no white America, there's only one America, that mattered too. That matters quite a bit because of who said it, how they said it, and how it resonates, how it hits the ear of the listener or the eye of the reader of the words, and it spreads. The I Have a Dream speech was certainly one of those moments where words matter, words inspire. An unplanned portion of a day that was full of speeches reverberates to this day. See, Dr. King had political instincts. He did. He knew when to say things and when not to say things. But when it comes to political instincts, there was a president of that time period. I mentioned that the March on Washington was in 1963. Something terrible happened that year when President Kennedy was assassinated. Upon his assassination, Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes president. And he has perhaps the best political instincts of any president at that time since Abraham Lincoln. He feels the mood in the air. We didn't have the kind of polling then that we have now. There's some polling, but not like we have now. And he read the situation in this country well. He was a white dude from Texas. And by the time he was president, he was a wealthy white dude from Texas. He was an old school politician, a good old boy, backslapping, glad-handing, told raunchy jokes in front of his male counterparts. He was he was a good old boy politician from the South. He, on paper, looks like the kind of person who would not be a friend of the civil rights movement. It's quite the opposite. He, through his political instincts, but his skills honed through years in serving in Congress, he passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He signs it into law in the summer of 64. Among other things, it guaranteed equal employment. It limited the use of literacy tests for voting, and it allowed federal law enforcement to ensure that public facilities were integrated, including schools. We're about 12 years at this point after Brown versus Board of Education, which said separate but equal is clearly not equal. Stop calling it equal. It's separate and it's unequal, so we're going to put a stop to that. Well, it didn't happen all at once. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is one example in American history and one of many examples during the civil rights movement of Congress and the president telling the people, in case you didn't hear us meaning the government, in case you didn't hear us the first time, you state and local governments, you can't be doing this. You cannot be doing things that blatantly violate the Constitution. In this case, the 14th Amendment. We said equal protection under the law all those years ago, before Johnson was even born. The government said those things, passed, the people ratified it into the Constitution. Stop breaking that rule. Stop violating the Constitution. Same thing, 1965, same situation with the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. Voting Rights Act really should have been covered by the 15th Amendment, but again, President Johnson and Congress have to step in and go, in case y'all didn't hear us the first time, you can't be discriminating against people when it comes to voting. But back to the Civil Rights Act of 64. I mentioned Lyndon Johnson's political instincts. He was up for re-election that year. He won in an electoral landslide. He won by a historic margin in a number of ways. He won by taking a bunch of southern states. He took some southern states, not all of them, Took some southern states, though, in that election after passing the Civil Rights Act, which certainly locked up support for him in the more liberal states. He was a master politician. Not a perfect individual by a really long stretch. I don't even know if I'd call him a good person, but interesting president, and ended up being one of the key figures in the civil rights movement. So, moving on from that, there's a lot of sources, especially if you just read like little canned story, like one web page kind of sources online. They'll talk about the civil rights movement like it ended in '65, or maybe '68 with the assassination of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy. And you can make the case that it's not over. Remember, it's about people with power uniting their constituency against the common enemy of equality. It's about perpetuating inequality institutionally through the law. It's hard to look at that process and say, "Oh, we've reached the promised land." I don't have the text in front of me, but I Have a Dream speech will be judged by the content of our character instead of the color of our skin. I don't think we're there yet. Working on it. Good people are doing the right thing and working towards that end. But moving past the 1960s, there's another element to inequality in this country under the law that we cannot leave this semester without touching on a little bit. And that has to do with the criminal law. It has to do with penalties of law, about arrest and warrants and those kind of things. And you saw that the penalty issue, meaning how much prison time, jail or prison time or probation do you get for committing a certain crime. Specifically under Presidents Nixon, 1970s, Reagan in the 1980s, Bill Clinton, 1990s, saw some laws passed related to criminal penalties that disproportionately impacted black people, people of color. You could definitely argue some of those impacted Hispanic people disproportionately. I mean, not argue, I mean, it's a fact. They did this as compared to white people. And so really just minorities in general impacted disproportionately by some of these criminal justice initiatives. Was all that intentionally racist? Maybe, sure, to a certain extent. You can make a case that Nixon was just straight up racist. He said some racist stuff for sure. Reagan, definitely. Clinton's interesting though, because President Clinton always had relatively high turnout and strong support among black voters. But he passed a couple pieces of legislation that were not favorable that were disfavorable to people of color when it comes to criminal law. It's actually a type of racism to not even think about the racial implications of laws that you're passing and policies that you're making as a policy maker. So in other words, it's one thing if someone sits down and says, I'm going to pass a law that blatantly discriminates against black people. That's racist, clearly. But if you pass a law without even thinking about that, or thinking about it and just brushing it away, thinking, oh, it's not that big a deal, that's racist too. Of course it is. Our policymakers should be abiding by the 14th Amendment and making sure there's equal protection for everyone under the law. And the three presidents I mentioned and others in between there since 1960 to the present haven't always done that. No matter what, throughout this timeline, the events I've discussed today and elsewhere, remember the words Dr. King said, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That we're all caught in a web of, inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one indirectly affects all. I'm messing this up entirely. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And I'm laughing at myself here, but these are great words. Yeah, whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly, because We're all part of the same system, governmentally, and as humans. We're all part of the same place here. We're all part of the same system. We're all in this together. And what happens to you impacts me whether I know it or not. What happens to me impacts you whether you know it or not. And that's all Dr. King was saying. So what does all this say about American government and politics? This is our last lecture, but well, Monday I'm going to assign the final exam. So tune in Monday. But this is the last lecture with any content. What does all this I said today and the last week or so have to do with American government and politics? I'm telling you that this country has witnessed the great irony of a document, the Constitution, of which almost half the folks who wrote it and signed off on it were slave owners. We witnessed the great irony of that document being an instrument by which people can free themselves from oppression. That a slave owner who fathered children of African descent, wrote the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." That we go from electing a black Christian man named Barack Hussein Obama as president, and then a few years later, our government tries to ban immigration from predominantly Muslim countries. That the process of solving inherent inequalities of government is a complicated one and a difficult process, but the solutions themselves need not be complicated. The words are actually already written down. They're already in the law. Words like freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to worship, due process of law, and equal protection under the law. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that we are endowed by our creators with the inalienable rights, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The words are written, but people must use them. This is about people using the right words in the right ways to do the right thing, no matter how difficult that is. That's what America could be. And that's what it means to be an American today. Thank you all so much for not only being in the class this semester, but also for hanging with us during these complicated times. Don't forget to comment below that you watched the video. As tongue-tied as I am today, I think we've hit on some pretty important stuff. Let me know you watched the video. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll try to address them Monday. But Monday will most definitely be about the final exam. And you'll have a few days to get that in. And it won't be hard. My quizzes are never that difficult. It'll be a little longer than a quiz, but you'll have a few days to do it. So it shouldn't be too difficult. Most of you are doing great in the class right now. Your grades are good. And so let's keep it going. Let's see you through the end of the semester. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and I will talk to you Monday.